While the Allies despised German machine guns in World War II for their incredibly elevated rate of fire, the Germans, on the other hand, despised the incredible power of the M2 Browning and its 50 BMG cartridge. After all, it didn't receive nicknames like Meat Chopper and Kraut Mower for nothing. But the genuine story is actually much darker and, well, as you could imagine, after being struck by such a round, more gruesome. Okay, so let's proceed back now and clarify why and how what would transform out to be the M2 was generated. In World War I, it was recognized how significant effective machine guns were. But during that period, machine guns were firing the identical ammunition as infantry rifles. And as new wonders of the battlefield emerged, like the initial armored planes and tanks, they demonstrated the necessity for something with a heavier punch. So General John Pershing specifically demanded a new machine gun that could destroy these circumstances much more effectively than the .30 caliber machine guns they possessed. That request was given to John Browning, America's most famous gun designer. He received the requirements to generate a new machine gun that would fire a half-inch round at a velocity over 2,700 feet per second, which was a substantial jump from anything he had designed before. He then assumed his already reliable M1917 .30 caliber water-cooled machine gun and basically scaled it up to fire a new, much larger cartridge. That new cartridge was also a scaled-up version of the .30-06 with a particular request to be rimless for smoother feeding and with some inspiration from the captured German 13.2 mm anti-tank rifle cartridge. It became the 50 BMG or 12.7 by 19.9 mm. They didn't recognize it at the occasion, but they had generated one of the most effective cartridges that was soon about to possess plenty of utilization on the battlefield. After some back and forth, the initial prototype was prepared for evaluation and soon entered production as the M1931, a water-cooled heavy machine gun intended mostly for anti-aircraft utilization. It was then evaluated to observe where else it could be utilized, and at first it wasn't appearing very promising. Infantrymen couldn't handle it as it was excessively heavy to carry, weighing about 120 pounds in the water-cooled version, or 84 pounds for the lighter air-cooled model, with the tripod adding another 44 pounds, so a complete ground setup ranging between 130 and 170 pounds plus all the ammunition for it, which also wasn't light, was not providing a promising future, not to mention it possessed substantial recoil, making it difficult to fire accurately. Smaller aircraft of the period also couldn't make much utilization of it, and for vehicle utilization mounted in early small turrets, it was also problematic as it could be fed only from the left side. So at first the only genuine utilization was as an anti-aircraft coastal gun, but no one could imagine just how everything would soon transform. John Browning passed away in 1926, but development continued, and his design was refined. Internal parts were transformed so the feeding could be quickly switched between left or right side feed by transforming the top cover, and a universal receiver was developed on which could be mounted either a water-cooled barrel with its jacket, a heavy air-cooled barrel, or a light air-cooled barrel for aircraft utilization. This concept now commenced appearing promising, and with other smaller improvements, the gun received the designation M2 Browning machine gun. During this period, other nations had transformed to heavier weapons like 20 or 30 mm cannons, but the Americans believed the 50 caliber's elevated velocity and adaptability would still make it effective. So it remained in production, and just how effective it would be was now going to be discovered out as the new global conflict commenced, and the M2 transformed into the legendary Mauser, 50 caliber, or just 50 as soldiers would soon be calling it. Mauser, if you didn't recognize, was coined from the words mother and deuce, signifying two, something like mother of machine guns, and it transformed out to be quite close to that. Now, as World War II broke out, the United States already possessed M2s serving in multiple roles: fixed aircraft guns, anti-aircraft guns mounted on ships, bombers or vehicles, and of course on tripod mounts for infantry utilization. Effective against almost anything they might encounter on the battlefield. At first, the most substantial utilization was on aircraft with lighter barrels and a tuned-up rate of fire from around 500 to about 1,200 rounds per minute. Remember, this is almost the identical rate of fire as the German MG42, although it was intended only for short bursts and was tuned up so much because on aircraft or anti-aircraft utilization, you'd possess only a short time window before your targets received out of sight. And in some configurations, the M2 genuinely reached absurd levels, like, for example, you've all received of the B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, which utilized M2s for protection against enemy fighter interceptors. In the G model, it carried up to 13 of them mounted in twin configurations in various turrets. The fighter bomber P-47 Thunderbolt possessed 8 of them, 4 in each wing. While the Douglas A-26 Invader assumed this to another level with, listen to this, up to 18 M2s mounting 8 in the nose, 4 in each wing, and 2 in the turret. The M2 immediately proved to be a substantial improvement over lighter around 30 caliber machine guns early in the war and possessed that neat balance between rate of fire and single round power, more than adequate to down an enemy fighter or bomber aircraft. It could easily proceed through engine blocks, particularly with armor-piercing rounds. And when you possess several of them firing at the identical occasion, it's dangerous for anything on the battlefield. American fighter planes would strafe locomotives, armored vehicles, and even tanks with great effectiveness since the roof armor was always thinner. Very soon into the war, the heavy barrel variant became a must-possess on almost all tanks and vehicles and wherever else they could mount it. Already by 1945, millions of M2s had been produced, making it the most produced machine gun ever. And the Germans were frustrated that American heavy machine guns were simply everywhere on the battlefield. This also made every attack from low-flying fighter aircraft or dive bombers like the Stuka much riskier because almost every Jeep, half-track and tank possessed a 50. This is why on tanks the M2 was mounted on the back of the turret and operated by a soldier standing on the engine deck. This approach, it could fire upward in case of an air attack, although the gunner was outside the relative safety of his tank. Before we get into battle, here is an explanation in case you ever wondered why Browning's barrel proceeds back after firing. The M2 operates on the short-recoil principle, where the barrel and bolt start locked together and relocate rearward as one unit after firing. That maintains the cartridge case supported while chamber pressure is still elevated, so it would not rupture when extraction commences. After traveling backwards some 10 mm, the barrel arrests, and the bolt continues rearward on its own, extracting and ejecting the spent case. As it relocates, it compresses the recoil spring, which forces the bolt forward again, extracting a new round from the disintegrating belt, chambers it, and fires again, repeating the process for as extended as the trigger is compressed. Now let us discuss how the Germans looked upon them and why they despised the 50s for several reasons. The initial and most obvious one is that Americans commenced relying more and more on overwhelming firepower as their main tactic. And the Germans, of course, were terrified by it. The Americans never suffered from a deficiency of ammunition like the Germans accomplished. And it appeared that anything with wheels or wings on the battlefield possessed at least one heavy machine gun. Getting fired at by 50 cals is nowhere near the identical as smaller caliber rounds, and they substantially outrange lighter machine guns. Just observe at the distinction between the 8mm Mauser round the MG42 fired and the 50 caliber beside it. The 50 delivers between 5 and 10 occasions more energy than all other weapons utilized by the infantry. So if you were fighting from a house, for example, concrete or brick walls would not protect you anymore, as the rounds would either proceed through the wall and eliminate you, or if not with the initial round, a longer burst concentrated on one spot would collapse the whole wall section or shred your sandbag bunker. Even superior armored tanks like the Panzer IV, when struck by heavy 50 caliber fire, could let some rounds slip through, particularly from the side or rear, or possess their optics and tracks destroyed or turret jammed. Lightly armored Japanese tanks in the Pacific, for example, were knocked out by the 50s easily, particularly when they came in banzai charges, which transpired on multiple occasions, surprising American tankers who opened up on them with everything they possessed. There is also one controversial circumstance about the 50 in World War II, and that is the myth that it was stated to possess been banned by the Geneva Conventions because of its devastating effect on the human physique. This was a myth, but the effect on the physique was not exaggerated. Basically, if you are struck by a 50 in any part of the physique, you are either going to forfeit that part if surviving without it is possible, or you're going to perish. And numerous German soldiers were unfortunate, adequate to witness that. When the 50 BMG's energy transferred to a human physique, it generated an effect so gruesome that we can't even describe it here because of YouTube. But I'm sure you received the concept. If it can accomplish that to a wall or a watermelon, imagine what it accomplishes to a human physique. So now you comprehend the German soldiers' concern about it. They adapted their tactics to counter American heavy machine gun positions, shifting from direct assaults to eliminating them out with snipers, tanks, or indirect fire with mortars and artillery. And to add on top of that, the Germans never possessed anything like it. Their heavy machine gun of the war was the MG42 or the MG34 when mounted on the Lafette tripod, which was considered the heavy machine gun configuration. And while the Lafette tripod was genuinely ingenious and provided German machine guns extreme accuracy and greater range, the 8mm Mauser round they were firing possessed nowhere near the punch the 50 BMG possessed. The closest circumstance to the M2 the Germans possessed was their 13mm heavy machine gun, but it was utilized only on fighter aircraft. The Germans accomplished plan to utilize captured M2s mounted on U-boats as anti-aircraft weapons when they possessed to surface to charge batteries. And they even produced copies of 50 BMG rounds for this purpose, which demonstrates they respected it, although actual utilization occurred only in rare cases. Now, before we get into some terrifying modifications of the M2 machine gun, let's assume an observation at the different round categories they are firing. The standard one was ball-full metal jacket with some serious destructive force, of course, but there are also specialized exotic variants, making it even more effective. Firstly, we possess several versions of armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate around an inch of hardened steel. Then we possess incendiary rounds designed to ignite flammable material, which is quite effective when you fire at enemy aircraft, for example. So on top of its fuel leaking upon strike, it could also be easily ignited. There are armor-piercing incendiaries, combining both functions of the two rounds previously mentioned. Armor-piercing incendiary tracer, as the name suggests, adds a tracer element for spotting strikes, which, again, is useful for anti-aircraft fire or for adjusting your fire at longer range, as you'd observe where the rounds are landing because the 50 BMG rounds are effective even at longer ranges of over 2 kilometers. Belts for M2 are usually loaded with a combination of rounds with a tracer every 5th round for standard ground utilization, while aircraft would load a combination of armor-piercing, incendiaries, and tracers for dogfights or ground attacks, depending on for what job they required it. After World War II, some fancy intriguing rounds were developed, like the Raufoss multi-purpose round. This one combined everything in one cartridge with an armor-piercing tungsten core plus a small explosive and incendiary charge that also generates fragmentation. It behaves like a 20mm cannon shell, but in a 50 BMG package. Then there's the SLAP, short for Saboted Light Armor Penetrator, which functions similarly to much larger armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds that tanks are firing. It possesses a small sub-caliber penetrator made from very dense material, usually tungsten, and possesses much superior armor penetration while being quite effective against light armored vehicles or helicopters. However, these are usually utilized in sniper rifles, as it is not a cheap round to fire in full auto. Oh, and yeah, while we mentioned sniper rifles, the 50 BMG cartridge impressed the American military so much that they constructed a sniper rifle around it. The most famous example is Carlos Hathcock, the legendary sniper from the Vietnam War, who experimented with an M2 machine gun by mounting a telescopic sight on it for engaging targets with single fires at long range where standard smaller caliber sniper rifles weren't so effective. He even scored confirmed eliminations this approach with a scoped M2. This inspired and later culminated in creation of the M82 Barrett, the so-designated anti-materiel sniper rifle chambered in 50 BMG that became famous in the American Army. This video about the 50 wouldn't be complete without something designated the Quad 50. When one heavy machine gun is not adequate, well, you simply assume 4 of them and mount them on a single platform and point it at anything you'd wish to cease to exist. This is the M45 Maxon quad mount. Originally generated for mobile defense against low-flying aircraft, 50 BMG was beneficial for firing the aircraft down, but the difficulty was its reduced rate of fire and the short period window the gunner possessed to strike a fast-moving target. So it was multiplied by 4, and now every second about 40 rounds were fired. Germans possessed similar but even more powerful concept with their quad 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, but it was a much heavier infrastructure specifically for anti-aircraft role, while quad 50 was much simpler and versatile. Electrically operated turret could quickly traverse it all around and up to 90 degrees upward to quickly receive a target in sight. It could be positioned on the ground on its own or mounted on vehicles. And it wasn't extended before someone transformed the quad 50 on ground targets, particularly later in the war when the Allies gained the upper hand in air dominance, so they didn't possess to worry much about the Luftwaffe. They were utilized for infantry support as well, and the effect of 450s firing at a single spot is just devastating. This quad 50 lived even after the war and witnessed combat in the Korean and Vietnam Wars as well. It was even creatively mounted on trucks to protect convoys from ambushes. As for the 50 caliber gunners from the Second World War, to this day, they possess serious firepower in their hands. But that came with the cost that the enemy would accomplish anything to receive rid of them as soon as possible. So they'd pretty quickly attract the attention of their opponents with their distinctive firing sound, smoke, and muzzle flashes. I don't recognize why, but for excessively extended earlier 50 caliber gunners on vehicles and tanks didn't possess shields to protect them from enemy small arms fire. They were standardized far later in the Vietnam War, and even Humvees in more modern wars didn't possess shields until horrible losses from snipers or urban combat transpired, when they commenced making turrets and later introduced remote weapon stations like Crows that resolved this difficulty. Now, instead of positioning your head and upper physique out to fire the machine gun, the gunner fires with joystick and camera from the safety of his vehicle and utilizes advanced technology like a laser rangefinder, night vision, thermal views, and so on. They are even made to function not just with 50s but also other machine guns or automatic grenade launchers. As for the M2 Browning, it's fascinating how far it received from a weapon that wasn't appearing so promising at first, so far in actuality, that it is still very much utilized to this day, with only minor transformations and improvements to it, and the identical core design from over a century ago. The most visible recent transformation was the M2A1 configuration with improved barrel transformation infrastructure, flash suppressor, and a manual safety, but other than that, it's more or less the identical weapon. I stated this about the MG42, how fascinating it is that such an old design is still utilized today in a modernized version. But when I accomplished research for Mauser, I recognized that it's even older, literally coming from the First World War, and it still remains a very useful platform and caliber with no retirement on the horizon for both.